Muslim teen bullied by racist neighbor, then Oprah arrives and teaches them a lesson. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The streets of Maplewood were as calm as ever that morning. Rows of pristine houses lined the quiet neighborhood, each one surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns and white picket fences. To most, it looked like the ideal suburban dream, a place of comfort, peace, and friendly faces. But for Amina, Maplewood was far from perfect. Amina walked slowly down the sidewalk, her books clutched tightly to her chest. She was 14, dressed modestly in a navy blue hijab and long sleeves despite the summer heat. Her dark eyes darted around cautiously as she walked past rows of houses, shoulders tense, as though bracing for something she couldn't quite predict. This was her routine every day after school. Walk quickly, avoid eye contact, and pray that Greg wasn't outside. Greg was Amina's neighbor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a loud, brash voice that could cut through the calmest morning. He had lived in Maplewood for years, and in all that time he had made it very clear that he didn't like people like her. Sometimes Greg's hatred was quiet, a lingering stare or a muttered insult as she passed. But other times, like today, it was loud. Amina turned the corner near Greg's house, her heart sinking when she spotted him standing on his lawn. His arms were crossed, his face red as he spoke to another neighbor about something trivial. The moment he saw her, though, his expression darkened. "Hey!" Greg shouted, taking a few steps toward the sidewalk. "Where do you think you're going?" Amina froze for just a second, her fingers tightening around her books. "Keep walking," she told herself. "Don't stop." "Hey, I'm talking to you." Greg's voice grew louder, angrier. He stepped onto the sidewalk, blocking her path. Amina looked up at him, her face calm but her eyes pleading. "Excuse me," she said softly, trying to move around him. Greg stepped in her way again, his hands gesturing wildly as he shouted. "You don't belong here. This isn't your neighborhood. How many times do I have to tell you that?" Across the street, curtains shifted as neighbors peered through their windows. A couple walking their dogs slowed down, whispering to each other as they watched the scene unfold. Amina's face burned with humiliation. "Please let me pass," she said, her voice shaking. "Go back to where you came from." Greg barked, his face twisted in a sneer. "We don't need people like you here walking around like you own the place. You think you're better than us? Wearing that thing on your head like it means something?" Tears pricked at Amina's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She tried to sidestep him again, but Greg's voice rose louder, his insults now echoing down the block. "Why don't you speak up, huh? You're so quiet. Don't you have anything to say?" At that moment, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The car door opened, and out stepped a tall, elegant woman in a cream-colored suit. Her heels clicked softly against the sidewalk as she walked toward Greg and Amina, her presence commanding and undeniable. It was Oprah Winfrey. The neighborhood seemed to freeze as Oprah approached. The dog walkers stopped in their tracks. Neighbors peered through their windows in disbelief. Even Greg's voice faltered as he realized who was standing in front of him. "Excuse me," Oprah said, her voice calm but firm. She looked directly at Greg, her expression unreadable. "Is there a problem here?" Greg blinked, momentarily caught off guard. No problem." Oprah's gaze sharpened. "It sounds like there's a problem," she said, her voice low but pointed. She turned to Amina, her expression softening. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Amina nodded quickly, though her voice trembled when she spoke. "I'm fine." Oprah turned back to Greg, who was now shifting uncomfortably under her gaze. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Greg bristled, trying to regain his composure. "I'm just making sure she knows her place, that's all. People like her." "Stop right there," Oprah interrupted, holding up a hand. Her voice was still calm, but there was steel beneath it. The quiet authority in her words was enough to make Greg freeze mid-sentence. "People like her?" Oprah repeated, raising an eyebrow. "And who, exactly, do you think you are to judge this young woman?" Greg opened his mouth to speak, but Oprah wasn't done. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "Do you know her name? Do you know her story? Or have you decided that you know everything about her just because of how she looks?" Greg stammered, unable to answer. "This young woman," Oprah continued, gesturing to Amina, "is walking home with her books in her hands, minding her own business. And here you are, yelling at her, trying to shame her for being herself. Why?" Greg had no response. He crossed his arms tightly, but his expression was less certain now. The crowd of onlookers had grown, and their eyes were on him, watching, judging. Oprah turned back to Amina, her tone gentle. You don't need to listen to him, sweetheart. You belong here as much as anyone else does. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Amina's eyes widened as she looked up at Oprah, her heart swelling with gratitude. No one had ever spoken up for her like this. The silence that followed Oprah's words seemed to stretch across the entire block. For the first time, Greg looked small, his bravado shrinking under the weight of her calm yet unrelenting gaze. Neighbors watched in hushed awe, some ashamed of their silence, others grateful that finally someone, had spoken up. Greg shuffled his feet, trying to regain his composure. Look, I'm just saying, this isn't how things are done around here. Oprah raised an eyebrow, her expression unwavering. How things are done? And what exactly does that mean? Greg stammered, his words faltering. Well, people like her don't fit in. She doesn't look like the rest of us. Enough, Oprah said firmly. Her voice wasn't loud, but the authority it carried could have silenced an entire stadium. I don't think you understand the damage you're causing, not just to this young girl, but to yourself and this entire community. Greg opened his mouth again, but Oprah stopped him with a wave of her hand. She wasn't here to argue, she was here to teach. Oprah turned to Amina, kneeling slightly so they were eye level. Sweetheart, can I ask you something? Amina nodded, her voice small. Yes. What's your name? Amina, she said softly. That's a beautiful name, Oprah said, smiling warmly. And what were you doing just now before all of this happened? I was just walking home from school, Amina replied. I'm in 9th grade. 9th grade, Oprah repeated, nodding. And do you love school? Amina smiled faintly for the first time, clutching her books. I do. I want to be a doctor one day. Oprah beamed. A doctor. That's wonderful. You'll make an amazing doctor someday, Amina. Amina's eyes widened, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't felt in a long time, pride. Oprah stood and turned back to Greg, the crowd around them growing as more neighbors emerged to watch. Greg, Oprah began, her voice softer now but no less firm. Do you know what this young girl has faced day in and day out just for walking down the street? Do you know what it's like to be looked at as if you don't belong, to hear whispers, to feel like you're less? Greg said nothing, his arms still crossed tightly. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Doubt. Reflection. Hatred, Oprah continued, doesn't come naturally. It's learned. It's passed down, sometimes without us even realizing it. But do you know what else can be learned? She paused, letting the question hang in the air. Kindness, respect, understanding. Those things can be learned too, but only if we're brave enough to open our hearts and listen. The crowd murmured quietly, the weight of her words sinking in. Greg shifted uncomfortably, the fight slowly draining from his posture. This young girl, Oprah said, gesturing to Amina, has done nothing to deserve your hatred. And yet you've chosen to target her, to shout at her, to make her feel small. But tell me, Greg, what does that say about you? Greg looked away, unable to meet her eyes. The neighbors stared at him now, their silence more damning than any words. For years, Greg had spewed his anger unchecked, but now the tables had turned. Oprah took a step closer to him, her tone softening slightly. We all have a choice, Greg. We can choose to hold on to our anger and fear, or we can choose to be better, to see people for who they really are, not for what we assume about them. Greg's face flushed, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might argue. But instead, he let out a shaky breath and mumbled, I didn't mean. Oprah held up a hand. It's not too late, Greg. It's never too late to change. She turned back to the crowd now, her voice carrying across the street. And that goes for all of us. How many of you have seen things like this happen and said nothing? How many of you have looked the other way, thinking it wasn't your problem? A few people shifted awkwardly, their eyes downcast. The dog walkers who had stopped earlier now stood frozen, unsure what to say. It is your problem, Oprah said, her voice gentle but unrelenting. We can't sit back and stay silent when we see injustice, no matter how small it may seem. Silence isn't neutral, it's a choice. And every time we choose silence, we allow hatred to grow stronger. The crowd fell still. Oprah's words struck a chord, reverberating through the hearts of everyone gathered there. People who had once ignored Amina, who had whispered behind her back or watched from a distance, now felt the weight of their inaction. Oprah turned to Amina again, her expression soft and kind. Amina, I want you to know something. You are enough. You are strong. You are smart. And you belong here just as much as anyone else. Tears welled up in Amina's eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she let them fall. They weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of relief, of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Oprah smiled warmly. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise, sweetheart. You are destined for great things." Amina nodded, clutching her books tightly as if they were a lifeline. For the first time she felt seen, not as the girl in the hijab, not as a target, but as Amina. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmuring quietly among themselves. Some approached Amina to offer small smiles and words of kindness, gestures that, while simple, meant more to her than they could have imagined. Greg stood frozen on his lawn, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He watched as neighbors who had once silently agreed with him now turned away, shaking their heads in disappointment. Oprah approached him one last time, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You have a choice to make, Greg. Do you want to be the man who shouts at children, or do you want to be better than that?" Greg didn't answer, but the question lingered as Oprah turned and walked back toward her car. Amina watched Oprah go, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. As the black SUV disappeared down the street, she stood a little taller, her shoulders no longer hunched under the weight of fear. Tom Jacobs, an older neighbor who had watched the entire scene unfold, approached her slowly. He removed his cap, holding it awkwardly in his hands. "Amina," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not saying anything sooner." Amina looked up at him, surprised. "Thank you, Mr. Jacobs." He smiled faintly, his eyes kind. "You keep your head high, kid. You're braver than most of us ever will be." Amina nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I will." As she turned to walk home, the sun shone brightly above her, and for the first time, the streets of Maplewood didn't feel so heavy. The quiet that followed Oprah's departure felt heavier than the loudest noise Greg had ever heard. He stood there, frozen on his lawn, staring at the empty street as if waiting for the ground to swallow him whole. The crowd had scattered, the murmurs dying down until all that remained was silence, and the weight of what had just happened. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets as he glanced across the street. Amina was walking away now, her steps slow but steady. She looked smaller somehow, yet stronger at the same time, like someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long and was finally learning to let it go. Greg's neighbor, Tom Jacobs, lingered nearby. He stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head in disappointment. When their eyes met, Tom's gaze was unrelenting, cutting through Greg's defenses like a blade. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Greg," Tom said, his voice low but firm. Greg swallowed hard, but he had no words. What could he say? The truth was right there in front of him, and for the first time he couldn't deny it. That night, Greg sat alone at his kitchen table, the events of the day replaying over and over in his mind. The sound of Oprah's voice echoed like a drumbeat. "It's not too late to change." Her words haunted him. For years, Greg had clung to his anger, his prejudice, without ever questioning where it came from or why he held on to it so tightly. It was easier that way, easier to blame others for what he didn't understand, to lash out rather than look inward. But now he couldn't ignore it. He thought of Amina, her face as she stood there, holding her books, enduring his hatred with quiet dignity. She hadn't shouted back. She hadn't fought him. She had simply stood there, her strength silencing his cruelty more effectively than anything else ever could. Greg ran a hand through his hair, his chest tight. For the first time in years he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: shame. Across the street, Amina sat in her room, the events of the day still fresh in her mind. She looked at herself in the mirror, her fingers brushing over the fabric of her hijab. For years, this piece of cloth had been a part of her, an expression of her faith, her identity, and her strength. But to so many others, it was all they saw. She thought about Oprah's words. "You are enough. You belong here just as much as anyone else." Amina let out a shaky breath, tears stinging her eyes. For so long she had tried to make herself invisible, hoping that if she stayed quiet and out of the way, people like Greg would leave her alone. But it hadn't worked. Hiding hadn't protected her. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Amina turned to her desk, where her notebooks and textbooks were stacked neatly in a pile. Her dream of becoming a doctor had always been her anchor, the thing that kept her moving forward no matter how hard life got. But today something had changed. Oprah had shown her that her voice mattered, that she mattered. And for the first time, Amina began to believe it. The next morning, Greg stepped out onto his porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. The neighborhood was quiet, the air crisp and cool. He stood there for a long moment, staring across the street at Amina's house. A part of him wanted to pretend that yesterday hadn't happened, to go back to his old routine, his old habits, and shove the guilt back into the corner of his mind where he didn't have to face it. But he couldn't. Greg set his coffee down and walked across the street. His steps felt heavy, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached Amina's door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking gently. The door opened and Amina's mother appeared, her expression guarded as she looked at Greg. "Can I help you?" Greg cleared his throat, his voice rough. "I'd like to speak to Amina if that's all right." Her mother studied him carefully for a moment before calling over her shoulder. "Amina, someone's here to see you." Amina appeared in the doorway, her books clutched to her chest. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Greg standing there, but she didn't say anything. Greg shifted awkwardly, running a hand through his hair. "Listen," he began, his voice low. I owe you an apology. For yesterday. For all the times before that." Amina stared at him, her expression unreadable. "I was wrong," Greg continued, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it. You didn't deserve any of that. None of it. And I'm sorry." Amina studied him for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the discomfort on his face, the guilt in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was real. Finally, she spoke softly. "Thank you." Greg looked up, surprised. He had expected anger, rejection, anything but kindness. "I hope you meant what you said," Amina added, her voice steady. "Because words don't mean much if you don't change." Greg nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll do better. I promise." Amina's mother stepped forward, resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. "It's a start." Greg nodded again before turning and walking back across the street. His heart felt lighter, though he knew he had a long way to go. The story of Oprah's intervention spread quickly through Maplewood. People who had once stayed silent began to speak up, reflecting on their own biases and how they had treated Amina, and others like her. Neighbors who had avoided Amina now smiled and waved when they saw her. Some even stopped to apologize, offering words of kindness and support that, while overdue, still meant something. The ripple effect of Oprah's words was undeniable. One evening, the town held a small community meeting in the park to talk about diversity and understanding. Amina's family was invited, and though they were hesitant at first, they decided to go. When they arrived, Amina was surprised to see so many people there. Neighbors, teachers, even Greg, who sat quietly in the back. A microphone had been set up at the front, and Tom Jacobs stood nearby, acting as the moderator. "We're here tonight," Tom began, "because we all have something to learn. And we're here because we want to be better neighbors, better friends, and better people." He looked out at the crowd. "Amina, would you like to say something?" Amina's heart raced as every pair of eyes turned toward her. For a moment, she hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. But then she remembered Oprah's words. "You are enough. You belong here just as much as anyone else." She took a deep breath and walked up to the microphone. "Hi," she said softly, her voice carrying across the park. "My name is Amina. I'm 14 years old and I've lived in this town my whole life. I love reading, science, and one day I want to be a doctor." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "For a long time I felt like I didn't belong here. People made me feel small, like I was different in a way that made me less. But I'm not less. And no one else should feel that way either." The crowd listened in silence, her words hanging in the air like a weight. "I hope that we can all try to be kinder," Amina continued, "because kindness is stronger than hate. And everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, deserves to be treated with respect." When she stepped back, the crowd erupted into applause. Tom smiled proudly and even Greg clapped softly, his face thoughtful. Amina looked out at the people around her, neighbors who had once ignored her, teachers who had once overlooked her, and for the first time she felt seen. Truly seen. As the sun set over Maplewood that evening, the park buzzed with quiet conversations. People lingered, shaking hands, offering apologies and sharing stories. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't immediate, but it was progress. And at the center of it all was Amina, her head held high, her heart full of hope. The evening after the community meeting, Amina sat on the steps of her front porch, watching the street bathed in the soft orange glow of the setting sun. The day had been overwhelming. Standing in front of the crowd, speaking her truth, it was something she never thought she'd have the courage to do. Her mother brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly. Amina smiled faintly. "I just said what I needed to say." "You did more than that," her mother replied. You made people listen. You reminded them of who you are, of who we are. That's no small thing. Amina nodded, sipping her tea as she gazed across the street. She was surprised to see Greg standing at the edge of his lawn, his hands stuffed in his pockets. For a moment she thought he might turn away, but instead, he lifted a hand and gave her a small wave. Amina froze, unsure how to respond. Greg had been the source of so much pain for her, and yet there he was, awkward, unsure, but trying. Her mother noticed the exchange and spoke gently. People can change, Amina. Sometimes it just takes someone strong enough to show them how. Amina nodded slowly, waving back hesitantly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Greg began to change in ways that surprised the entire neighborhood. He no longer lingered outside, shouting or muttering under his breath. Instead, he kept to himself, his usual bluster replaced with quiet reflection. One Saturday afternoon, as Amina worked in her family's garden, she noticed Greg approaching slowly with a box in his hands. She tensed instinctively, the old feeling of dread creeping up her spine. "Hey," Greg said awkwardly, stopping a few feet away. I brought something for you." Amina straightened, wiping her hands on her sleeves. "What is it?" Greg opened the box carefully, revealing a small flowering plant. A bright green sapling with delicate white petals just beginning to bloom. "It's jasmine," he explained, his voice gruff. "I read somewhere that it's a symbol of peace. Thought maybe you'd like to plant it here." Amina stared at the plant, then back at Greg. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Greg said quickly. I wanted to do something right for once." Amina studied him carefully, searching for any hint of insincerity. But all she saw was a man who looked tired. Tired of the hatred he'd carried for so long, tired of being someone he no longer wanted to be. "Thank you," Amina said softly, taking the plant from his hands. "It's beautiful." Greg nodded, turning to leave. But before he walked away, he added, "For what it's worth, I'm trying to do better. I know I've got a lot to make up for." Amina watched him go, a small smile tugging at her lips. She looked down at the jasmine plant in her hands, its delicate petals swaying in the breeze. Maybe people could change after all. As summer turned to fall, the changes in Maplewood became impossible to ignore. The community had taken Oprah's words to heart, embracing small but meaningful efforts to build a more welcoming and inclusive neighborhood. The library held a Cultural Awareness Day, where families shared food, music, and traditions from their backgrounds. Amina's family brought homemade baklava, which quickly became a favorite among the neighbors. People who had once avoided them now stopped to chat, asking questions and listening with genuine curiosity. Even Greg attended, standing awkwardly at first but eventually joining a conversation with Amina's father about gardening tips. The two men laughed together over a shared complaint about squirrels stealing their tomatoes, and for the first time, Greg felt like a part of something instead of apart from it. The jasmine plant Greg had given Amina thrived in the garden, its sweet fragrance filling the air each morning. It became a quiet reminder that healing was possible, that even the most broken relationships could bloom into something new. One afternoon, Oprah's team reached out to Amina's family, inviting them to share their story on her talk show. At first, Amina was nervous. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the idea of telling her story on national television felt overwhelming. "What if I mess up?" she asked her mother, pacing nervously around the living room. Her mother smiled, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You won't mess up. Just speak from your heart like you always do. This is your chance to show the world how strong you are." Amina nodded, taking a deep breath. She thought back to Oprah's words that day on the sidewalk, "You are enough." And for the first time she believed it. The day of the show arrived sooner than Amina expected. She and her family traveled to the city, their nerves and excitement intertwining as they entered the brightly lit studio where Oprah's team had been preparing for hours. Amina sat backstage, her hands trembling as she clutched a small notebook filled with scribbled thoughts. She had practiced her answers over and over, but now that the moment was here, her mind felt like a blank slate. Her mother reached over, taking her hand gently. "You don't need to be perfect, Amina. Just be yourself. That's more than enough." Amina took a deep breath, looking at her mother with a small smile. "I'll try." The sound of applause echoed from the studio, signaling that the show had begun. Oprah's warm, familiar voice carried over the speakers, welcoming the audience. The calm authority in her tone eased Amina's nerves just a little, reminding her of that day on the sidewalk when Oprah had stepped in and changed everything. When it was finally time, a member of Oprah's team escorted Amina and her family onto the stage. The lights were bright, the audience attentive, but Oprah's smile was as warm as ever as she stood to greet them. "Welcome," Oprah said, taking Amina's hand and guiding her to the couch beside her. "I'm so happy you're here, Amina." "Thank you," Amina said softly, her voice shaking slightly. Oprah turned to the audience, her tone thoughtful. "Amina's story is one that reminds us of the power of kindness, and the damage that can be done when we allow prejudice and hatred to go unchecked. But it's also a story of strength, resilience, and growth." The audience applauded warmly, and Amina felt her nerves begin to settle. "Amina," Oprah continued, turning back to her, "tell us about that day. What were you feeling when everything happened?" Amina hesitated for just a moment before answering. "I was scared," she admitted. "And I was embarrassed. I didn't know what to do, I just wanted to disappear." The audience fell quiet, listening intently as Amina spoke. "But when you stepped in," Amina continued, looking at Oprah, "everything changed. You didn't just stop him, you made me feel like I mattered. Like I wasn't invisible anymore." Oprah smiled gently, her eyes shining with empathy. "Because you do matter, Amina. And you're not invisible. You are brave and you are strong." Amina nodded, her confidence growing as she spoke. "After that day, I realized that I couldn't keep hiding. I didn't want to be afraid anymore. I wanted to speak up, not just for myself but for anyone who feels like they don't belong." The audience erupted into applause, some wiping away tears as they listened to Amina's words. Oprah turned to Amina's parents, inviting them to share their perspective. Amina's father spoke about the challenges their family had faced, moving to a new country feeling like outsiders, and the struggles of raising children in an environment where they weren't always accepted. "But we're proud of Amina," he said, his voice steady. "She's shown us all what it means to be strong. And we're grateful to this community for learning to see her for who she really is." Oprah nodded thoughtfully. "It takes courage to change, not just for individuals but for entire communities. And Amina, you've been at the center of that change." At this, Amina's eyes widened slightly. "I didn't think I was doing anything special," she said softly. Oprah smiled warmly. "That's the thing about change, it starts small. A word, a moment, a choice. And before you know it, it spreads further than you ever thought possible." As the show neared its conclusion, Oprah surprised Amina with a special announcement. "Amina," Oprah said, "we wanted to honor your bravery, your resilience, and your dream of becoming a doctor. So, with the help of our partners, we're giving you a full scholarship to pursue your education and make that dream a reality." A collective gasp rose from the audience, followed by thunderous applause. Amina's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you serious?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Oprah nodded, smiling. "Yes, sweetheart. You've earned this." Amina's mother and father hugged her tightly, their own eyes shining with tears. It was more than they ever could have hoped for, a future full of promise, a chance for Amina to achieve everything she had dreamed of. Back in Maplewood, news of the show spread quickly. Neighbors who had once ignored Amina now stopped to congratulate her, offering hugs, flowers, and heartfelt words of encouragement. People spoke openly about the lessons they had learned, sharing stories of their own growth and commitment to being better. Even Greg couldn't escape the ripple effect. At first, he felt uncomfortable being the subject of so much conversation, but over time he began to accept it for what it was, an opportunity to grow. One afternoon, Greg knocked on Amina's door once again, holding a small handwritten note. When Amina opened the door, he handed it to her wordlessly and turned to leave. Amina opened the note carefully, her brow furrowing as she read the words inside. "Dear Amina, I know I can never take back the hurt I caused you, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be a better person. You taught me that it's never too late to change, and I'm grateful for that. I hope you can forgive me someday. Sincerely, Greg *. Amina folded the note, holding it tightly in her hands as she looked out at Greg's retreating figure. She wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive him completely, but she knew he was trying. And sometimes trying was enough to begin again. As the seasons changed and the jasmine plant in Amina's garden bloomed once again, Maplewood felt like a different place. The small acts of kindness that had begun after Oprah's visit had grown into something much bigger. A community that was learning to embrace its differences, to listen, and to support one another. Amina no longer walked with her head down. She no longer avoided the sidewalks or braced herself for cruel words. Instead, she walked tall, her steps confident and sure, knowing that she belonged exactly where she was. Her dream of becoming a doctor felt closer than ever, and she carried with her the lessons of that fateful day. The power of kindness, the courage to speak up, and the truth that even the smallest voices can change the world. Years later, as a young doctor in her white coat, Amina stood in a hospital room holding the hand of a nervous little girl. The girl clutched her mother's hand tightly, her eyes wide with fear. "What's your name?" Amina asked gently. "Layla," the girl whispered. "That's a beautiful name," Amina said with a warm smile. "Do you know what I wanted to be when I was your age?" The little girl shook her head. "A doctor," Amina said. "And do you know what I learned? That no matter who you are or where you come from, you can do anything. You're stronger than you know, Layla. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The little girl smiled faintly, her fear fading as Amina squeezed her hand reassuringly. As she walked out of the room, Amina glanced down at the pin on her coat, a tiny jasmine flower, a symbol of peace and resilience. She had come so far and her journey was far from over. But she carried with her the words that had changed everything. "You are enough. You belong here just as much as anyone else." And now she was passing that truth on to others, one voice, one heart, one life at a time. Months passed and life in Maplewood settled into a new rhythm, one marked by quiet but unmistakable change. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't immediate, but it was real. People who had once stayed silent now spoke up when they saw something wrong. Conversations around inclusion, respect, and understanding echoed through classrooms, parks, and community gatherings. And at the center of it all was Amina. Amina had become something of a quiet leader in the town. She didn't ask for it, but her courage had sparked something in others. Teachers invited her to speak in schools about her experience. At first, she was hesitant, unsure if anyone would listen. But as she stood in front of classrooms full of curious eyes, she found her voice. "Being different isn't something to be ashamed of," she told them. "It's what makes us who we are. I used to think that hiding would make things easier, but it didn't. The truth is, standing up for yourself, even when it's hard, is what makes you strong." Her words resonated far beyond the classroom walls. Kids who had once whispered about her in hallways now greeted her warmly. Parents who had stayed on the sidelines began to talk to their children about kindness and acceptance. Even Greg changed in ways that surprised everyone. It wasn't easy for him. Change rarely is. Greg spent weeks wrestling with guilt, shame, and confusion. He couldn't deny what had happened, couldn't undo the things he'd said. But he could try to make it right. Slowly, quietly, he began to show up, not just in words but in actions. He volunteered to help with the community garden project, working alongside Amina's father to plant flowers and vegetables for the neighborhood. At first, their conversations were stiff, little more than polite exchanges about weather and soil quality. But over time, the walls began to crumble. "I used to think I had all the answers," Greg admitted one afternoon as he wiped dirt from his hands. "That anyone who didn't look like me or live like me was somehow wrong." Amina's father looked up, his expression thoughtful. "What changed?" Greg glanced across the garden, where Amina was carefully planting a row of jasmine seedlings. "She did," he said simply. "She didn't fight back or yell at me. She just stood there holding her ground. Made me realize how small I was acting." Amina's father nodded. "It takes a strong person to admit when they're wrong." Greg let out a shaky breath, his voice low. "I'm trying to be better. I don't deserve anyone's forgiveness, but I'm going to keep trying anyway." And he did. Greg showed up to every community event, offering his help wherever it was needed. He began listening, really listening, to people he had once dismissed. Slowly, the neighbors who had avoided him began to accept his presence, recognizing that his efforts were genuine. Amina noticed too. She watched from a distance as Greg worked in the garden, cleaned up litter in the park, and greeted neighbors with quiet sincerity. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was enough for her to believe that people could change. One day, Greg knocked on Amina's door again, this time holding a small, carved wooden box. When she opened it, she found a delicate jasmine pendant resting inside. "I made it myself," Greg said awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "I'm not good with words, but I wanted to give you something to say thank you. You taught me more than I ever thought possible." Amina looked up at him, her expression soft. "Thank you, Greg. I appreciate this." He nodded, his voice quiet. "You didn't deserve any of the things I said or did. I can't take it back, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Amina smiled faintly, her fingers brushing over the pendant. "You're doing better, Greg. That's what matters." The next spring, the jasmine plant Greg had given Amina bloomed bigger and brighter than ever before. Its fragrance filled the air, a symbol of peace and growth that couldn't be ignored. The garden had become a community gathering space, where neighbors worked side by side to tend flowers, share stories, and build relationships that were once unthinkable. At the center of the garden, a small plaque was placed beside the jasmine bush. Read, "Planted in honor of kindness, resilience, and the courage to change." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything the town had been through. Years later, Amina returned to Maplewood as a young doctor, her white coat neatly pressed, her stethoscope draped around her neck. She had come a long way from the quiet girl who used to walk home with her head down, bracing for insults and whispers. Her family still lived in the same house, and the jasmine plant still bloomed in the garden, its flowers a reminder of how far they had come. One afternoon, Amina took a walk through the neighborhood, memories of her childhood flooding back with each step. The houses looked the same, but the energy in the air was different, warmer, kinder. Children rode bikes on the sidewalk, neighbors chatted over fences, and the streets no longer felt heavy with tension. As she passed Greg's house, she noticed him sitting on the porch, a mug of tea in his hands. His hair was whiter now, his face softened with age, but he still looked up and waved when he saw her. Amina smiled, waving back. For years, Greg had continued his quiet work in the community, volunteering, listening, and helping wherever he could. He had become a different man not because anyone forced him to change but because he chose to. "Good to see you, Doc," Greg called, his voice gruff but friendly. "Good to see you too, Greg," Amina replied, her smile genuine. As she walked back to her family's house, the sun warm on her face, Amina felt a sense of peace she hadn't known as a child. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become a part of her story, a story of strength, forgiveness, and the power of change. That evening, Amina sat on the porch with her parents, watching the sun set over the garden. The jasmine bush swayed gently in the breeze, its flowers glowing softly in the fading light. Her mother leaned over, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You've come so far, Amina. I hope you're proud of yourself." "I am," Amina said softly. "And I'm proud of this town too. We've all come so far." Her father nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's amazing what can happen when people choose to listen and learn." Amina smiled, her heart full. She thought back to Oprah's words that day on the sidewalk, the ones that had changed everything. "You are enough. You belong here just as much as anyone else." Those words had carried her through the hardest days, reminding her of her worth when the world tried to convince her otherwise. And now they were a part of her, a truth she would carry with her for the rest of her life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Amina looked out at the garden, the jasmine bush blooming proudly at its center. It was more than just a plant, it was a symbol of hope, of growth, and of the legacy she had helped build. Because in the end, it wasn't just about her story. It was about all the lives that had been touched, the hearts that had been opened, and the community that had learned to be better. And as long as that jasmine plant continued to bloom, Amina knew that her story, and the lessons it carried, would live on. Years later, people in Maplewood would still tell the story of the young girl who had faced hatred with courage, the man who had chosen to change, and the woman who reminded them all of what kindness can do. And somewhere in that quiet town, beneath the shade of a jasmine bush, the words that started it all would echo softly in the breeze. "You are enough."